everybody. It's Helen Hillix, and I am always happy to be here with you. This week, I am following up on last week's podcast and video about balancing masculine and feminine energies because I got lots of questions about it, about the topic, about why it's so important, about what does it really mean, about can you give me some examples? You know, many people simply didn't understand. So I'm going to dive into that topic again this week, and I really feel like it's worth more time for sure. So let's talk about what's happening in the world regarding balancing masculine and feminine energy. And then I will give you some examples of why it's so important in our lives and in our relationships. And then I will give you an exercise to do to begin actually balancing those aspects of yourself, the masculine and the feminine aspects of yourself. So let's dive in. You know, everybody wants to be powerful. Everybody wants to be powerful. And, you know, but our families and religion and societies, you know, they tell us how that ought to look. You know, women are supposed to be small and dainty. Women are supposed to be quiet and passive and loving and compassionate and supportive and receptive and sexy, but not whores and not aggressive and not direct, not outspoken. And men, on the other hand, in order to be powerful, have to be good providers and ambitious and driven and big and muscular and, you know, what everybody thinks of as masculine and goal-oriented. But men are not supposed to be sensitive and emotional. They're supposed to be logical, and they're not supposed to be needy. They're not supposed to be dependent. And I've talked about that aspect many times, that because men, and men are supposed to be sex-driven. You know, men are supposedly think about sex every 2 seconds or whatever it is. You know, that used to be what they said. And, you know, I've met lots of men who just are not that sexual. And so they're not considered to be that masculine. But because men are supposed to be sex-driven, they often translate the need to be sensitive and cuddly and affectionate and dependent and needy. They often channel that into sex. So it's all so out of balance. You know, I think you can begin to see that. But aren't we all both aspects? Aren't we all driven in some ways? Aren't we all goal-oriented? You know, whether it's the goal of keeping your house clean, if you're a stay-at-home mom, or the goal of raising your children well. I mean, it's like everybody has both aspects, and the more in balance you have those aspects, the more powerful you actually are. So let's stop a little bit and go back though. How many of you women were told that's not ladylike? You know, I remember this was, I don't know, 13 years ago or so. My stepson was he was 11 years old at the time or something like that. And he, you know, I farted and he said, that's not ladylike. Or maybe he even said, my mom says that's not ladylike, something like that. And I just wanted to smack him, you know, and is that me being a little overly masculine? Yeah. But I just couldn't believe that in this day and age, people are still saying that's not ladylike. I mean, it blew my mind. And, you know, I was raised in a pretty progressive household with a lot of equality between males and females and a lot of, you know, intentional balance between masculine and feminine. So, I mean, I was raised by a feminist mother, so it kind of blew me away, actually, that, you know, it's okay for boys and men to fart, but it isn't okay for girls and women. So, I mean, that's such a silly example, isn't it? But it's so true that, you know, we are told that's not ladylike. And this is the society trying to keep women in this little category and being dominated by the men who get to dictate what a woman should behave like. And of course, men, get pressured into being something that they're not as well. So, even though it's shocking, it still persists. I read a Facebook post recently of a little girl. It was an old-fashioned looking cartoon. A little girl is saying to her mom, Mom, what is a bitch? And the mom says, it's somebody that gets shit done, honey. And, I just, it's a woman who gets stuff done. It's something like that. And that I just laughed out loud. It makes me laugh every time I think of it. So it's like, that's the truth, though. If you look at politics, women politicians are so often, people use the B word about them because they're direct and they're forceful and they're all these things that only the masculine are supposed to be. And women are not supposed to have that masculine thing. So it's still prevalent, it still happens. And of course, the sad thing is that the men who perpetrate this, who are still into dominating the females by squeezing them into only feminine characteristics when actually everybody has both, is that they then are diminishing their feminine qualities and can't get them met except by sex. And how many sex scandals are there going on all the time? Because men are trying to get their need for sensitivity and connection and intimacy and dependency and, all of those things met by being sexual. And they are training their partners, not to be an equal, so they have no equal at home. And they feel alone. And that's the price that the masculine half pays if they are stuck in the masculine and not energizing their feminine. They are suppressing the women and to be all feminine, and they are suppressing themselves to be all masculine. And then neither party is happy. And I'm not talking about that it's nice to have a polarity. I'm not talking about that either, because a lot of studies about sacred sexuality talk about the need for polarity in order to have sexual chemistry. So I'm not talking about that. That is actually a thing too. But you know what? The polarity can switch. I could be in a masculine role and my husband could be in a more passive role, or vice versa. And that's the power, is the ability to shift between the masculine and feminine, whatever is appropriate or whatever will be for the highest good of all in that moment. So I want to give you some more examples, because that's one of the things that people talked about, is that they just didn't understand it. So there was a couple recently that I was working with, and they had spent some time apart and had felt like they drifted apart and this is just a week or 5 days, or it's a short time, but they are retired and spend a lot of time together, a lot of quality time together, but they hadn't. And it triggered both of them into their kind of habitual default ways of being. And the husband, who is, a very successful retired businessman and used to being, masculine, a very masculine man. And he is not used to being direct about his feminine aspects and what are considered more feminine feelings. And so he asked to spend time with his wife, and she got sidetracked on a task. And rather than coming to her and saying, honey, I really feel I need some reassurance, I'm feeling insecure, I'm feeling lost without our connection, he was complaining and angry. And of course, what did that do to her? She wasn't feeling centered either. She was also feeling the pain of their disconnection. So when he came to her in that complaining way, she shut down and felt pressured and controlled. And that's because her dad was very dominating over her mother, and she does not want to be dominated. She's also a retired, very successful businesswoman. So it's like she has both masculine and feminine, but in this couple, they both energize the masculine. They're both out of balance in energizing the masculine. And so every time something like this happens, he is in that negative complaining energy rather than his feminine, sensitive, sweet, insecure, rejected feeling energy, which is so much softer and so much more relatable. And she doesn't respond by staying in her feminine and exploring and saying, honey, I wonder why you're being so aggressive, because you're so sweet and sensitive usually. So, because she's not feeling grounded either. So they just triggered each other, and they spent a couple of days in this kind of painful dynamic. And until we met and started talking about, what are you really feeling? Well, I was feeling rejected. I was feeling insecure. I was feeling unimportant. And, the moment he started saying that, she started crying. And that's because she loves him. She doesn't want him to be hurt. She doesn't want her behavior to hurt him. But when he dropped down into his feminine aspect, which was really for the highest good of all in that moment, a lot of men feel like that is weak, but actually it's incredibly powerful. In that moment, his authentic self-expression broke the impasse, broke the stalemate, broke the distance and the separation, and she instantly started crying, dropped into her feminine aspects, and they could instantly bond and make apologies to one another and reconnect. That's power. That's power. And that's the power of being able to drop into your feminine aspect. Now, there is definitely power in the masculine also. Another example, and I may have talked about this last time, but I think it bears repeating, that parents, whether it's the father or the mother, it doesn't matter. They both really need to have balanced aspects. Let's take the mother first. If the mother is caught up in being the loving, soft, tender, gentle, all-accepting mother, then she's not going to discipline and provide the structure and the guidance that her children need to be able to reach their potential. And at the same time, the father, on the other hand, if he is only in the masculine and is, driving and you got to do this and, sit your butt down and do your homework and, and ends up using that kind of aggressive, intimidating almost. There are a lot of men who use intimidation with their children. And it's good to make your kids afraid of you. Well, no, it isn't. Because what happens when you make a child afraid of you, which is the abuse of the masculine energy, what happens then is that the child shrinks and only is afraid. That's their motivation, is to avoid that wrath of that out of balance masculine energy. They're afraid they're going to be hurt in some way. And so that lasts their whole lives. Or they become rebellious and say, you can't tell me what to do. I'm bigger than you now. So, that intimidation factor only lasts so long. Again, unless the person just becomes super passive and the father can intimidate them as long as he's alive, which happens too. But then they go out into the world, and that child learns to appease authority figures, not work out what really is for the highest good of all, but to appease and protect themselves from authority figures. And that just leads to seething resentment and oftentimes being passive aggressive. So if the father can develop the loving, affectionate, supportive aspect along with the calling the child to awareness and holding them accountable and all of that, then, and talking to the child about, I noticed you're not getting your homework done. What's going on there? It's like calling them to accountability and using the feminine qualities of listening and exploring and diving into the emotional aspects of why that child might not be getting their homework done. Much more effective in co-creating, a strong, emotionally healthy and balanced masculine and feminine child, whether they're male or female. They're going to be much more successful in the world. Another example is lovers. If you are lovers and one of you is trapped or dominated by the male energy and the other is trapped or dominated by the female energy, and again, this all applies whether you're gay, straight, bi, fluid gender, trans, whatever it is, we still need a balance aspect of masculine and feminine. But let's take the traditional stereotypic, the man is the masculine and the woman is the feminine. If the woman is trapped in the feminine energy in her sex life, then she's not going to be able to create sacred sexuality, because sacred sexuality requires courage and honesty. It requires deep intimacy. It requires a real connection. And if you are trapped in the feminine, you're not going to be able to say, I don't like that, or I do like that, or honey, I'd love it if you would do more of this, or she's not going to be able to initiate sex. And that's a complaint that I hear often from couples, is that she never initiates, or he never initiates sometimes. Men can be trapped in the feminine characteristics as well. So if the man, on the other hand, is dominated by the masculine energies, he's always going to feel like he's supposed to initiate. He's always supposed to be in the mood. He always has to initiate, and that ends up making him feel, it makes him experience being turned down. And then that leads to rejection. That's what I hear from men a lot, is I'm so tired of being rejected. But she doesn't necessarily mean to reject him. She's just tired or whatever it is. But if he feels like he always has to initiate because he's the masculine figure, and he doesn't get more feminine about that and talk about his feelings of insecurity and his need for affection, his need for connection, his need for intimacy, and he just channels it into the frequency of her saying yes, then that's not going to lead to real, connection, is it? So if the man can integrate his sensitive, emotional, more fluid, more flexible aspects of femininity into himself and into his sex life, and the female or feminine partner can integrate more of the masculine energy along with the feminine, then they can, again, that doesn't mean that they lose the polarity, but that they can be fluid and flexible, whatever is really called for at the moment. So you can see, I've given you an example in sex, I've given you an example in parenting, and I've given you an example in, just marriage, partnering relationships, period. And I think, another example would be an example at work. And as is the case, because we still are dominated, male-dominated society, so often the boss is a man. But, let's say the boss is a woman. I have a client who is a very masculine woman, and she is because she is in the construction business. She owns a huge company, and she has developed this very masculine way of being, even though she's a sweet, sensitive person, really. But she has overdeveloped those masculine traits, and it overflows into all of her other relationships with her kids. You should be doing this and this and this, and let me set a structure for you. But the missing piece is that accepting, loving, compassionate piece. So anyway, going back to the job thing, a woman being the head of a big construction company, she has slipped into that masculine energy, because without it, I'm sure she has experienced with other dealings with other construction companies and contractors and so forth, that they did not pay attention to her if she was not in that masculine energy. I have another client who is a doctor, and she says at home with her partner, she is very feminine. But in the hospital where she works, she has to stay in that masculine energy or they won't listen to her. So, our society isn't set up to encourage this. So we really have to take personal responsibility for it. We really have to take personal responsibility to shift that so that we can be fluid and flexible in our ability to use which aspect is called for in any given moment. So what do you do about this? I'm just going to give you one exercise today, and that is, I was talking to a friend of mine today who's a retired Navy SEAL, and he was talking about doing a series of movements. He studied martial arts for decades, I believe, and so his movements are more in the martial arts kind of tone. But the idea is, in order to integrate and energize and balance the masculine and feminine aspects of yourself, movement is a very powerful way of doing it. It's interesting because I'm seeing this a lot now. Another friend of mine is a young woman who is getting into the coaching world, and she's talking a lot now about movement and her morning ritual of how movement helps her to get in touch with all the aspects of herself. So I want to challenge you to do this every single morning and start out by choosing some movements that to you feel masculine and feminine. The masculine carrying that energy that you're moving through the world, and again, that you're those forceful kind of movements that, you're stepping forward, that you're punching forward, that you're, blocking, that whatever it is that you're, that masculine kind of energy that you're familiar with. And the feminine is more fluid. And he was saying that it's a really helpful thing if you slide your feet and stay grounded in that feminine movement part of your series. And then you are embracing, you are receiving, you are comforting, you are moving aside from the force that might be coming at you. So you're flexible and fluid, and that is your power. And he does a series of 7 movements every day, and you can do how many ever you feel inspired to do. But just as I'm doing it right now, I can feel that in my body. I can feel those masculine movements, and I can feel the feminine movements. I feel the energy, and I know you will too. So let me know if you have any questions, but I want to encourage you to take this on and realize how vital it is for us to have both masculine and feminine traits, and to energize them equally so that you can lead a fulfilled life and have the sacred sexuality that you want, and have the powerful parenting skills that you want, and have the healthy relationships that you want, and have that feeling of power inside yourself that you can trust, that you can dive into whatever part is really called for, and that you're not trapped or limited. Okay, guys, love you. I always love hearing from you. I love your questions and comments, and I will talk to you next week.